Casey Washington looks like a poor man's Drake London on offense, but special teams may hold the key for his long-term success in Atlanta.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. These sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. aka, and I've been covering the Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer that goes strong with me each and every day, because you tune in to this illustrious podcast each and every day as your first listen or first watch. And if you want to become an everydayer and be in this illustrious group of individuals, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are almost there. We're almost there, guys. Hopefully we'll be there at the end of the week, finishing up these scouting reports on all these draft picks. You know, never in previous years have we gone into July. Like usually we're done like June 20th at the latest on this, but you know, things came up. But we're almost there. We're doing Casey Washington today, doing my detailed scouting report. I finished the film a couple of days ago. I'll talk about some NFL player comps. I'll talk about why special teams is going to be critical to Casey Washington's NFL longevity. But first, we'll talk about his offensive skill set and how he projects as a wide receiver in the NFL. And the interesting thing about Casey Washington is, unlike a lot of college receivers, like he wasn't super productive at Illinois, right? He didn't have his only 100-yard game came in his final game of his collegiate career, where he went for 218 yards against Northwestern, thanks to a couple of big plays and catches. Had a lot of success against Northwestern throughout his career, which I guess is Illinois' rivalry team and whatnot, or one of their rivalry teams. But what's interesting is 3 of his 7 most productive games from a yardage standpoint across his career came in his final 3 games this past year. And those were games also, coincidentally, that Falcons undrafted free agent quarterback, John Paddock started. So maybe that sets up Casey Washington, working with Michael Penix and John Paddock, in the preseason, that he might go off this summer in the preseason, just because he has that sort of built-in rapport with the Falcons' 4th string quarterback, and hopefully is building that rapport with the Falcons' current 3rd string quarterback that is going to be their 2nd string and then 1st string quarterback at some point in the future. But, at Illinois, Casey Washington played a lot of Z wide receiver. That probably puts him on the depth chart behind Drake London, who we're expecting to play that role. I think their games are kind of similar in the sense that probably Washington's best trait is his contested catch ability. Pro Football Focus had him catching nearly 60% of his contested catches this past year, which is a good number, over 50% for his entire collegiate career. Now, my charting in the 7 games I watched from this past season only had him catching about 31% of his contested catch, but I think some of that is due to, quarterback era. And so if you sort of take out the quote unquote uncatchable or poorly thrown balls, it would probably bounce back to being that 50-60% in that regard. But I don't know if that's going to be as effective a tool for Casey Washington as it is for Drake London, just because Casey Washington isn't as big as Drake London. Right? He doesn't have sort of the ideal size that you're looking for in a guy that's going to out physical NFL corners, given that Casey Washington's 6'1", 201. Most of the successful contested catch guys in the NFL tend to be like 15, 20 pounds or more heavier than Casey Washington, because that allows them to get that size advantage against, typically 190, 195 pound corners on the outside in the NFL. And it's hard to out physical those guys when you only maybe outweigh them by a few pounds in Casey Washington's case. And it's much easier when you're like 220 pounds and you're outweighing those guys by 25, 30 or more pounds and whatnot. But, that's probably the best way he wins. He doesn't run a super expanded route tree, probably the preferred route that we saw him run at Illinois, at least in the 7 games I watched, the 55 targets I charted in those 7 games. The majority of them were fades, right? About 36% of them were fades, back shoulder fades, very effective in that area. And so you can imagine a scenario where if Casey Washington gets paired with a quarterback that can make those sort of back shoulder throws and throw them well, you could see Casey Washington turning into a decent option on the outside in the event that, Drake London goes down for, a game or 2 or something like that. You could maybe expect Casey Washington theoretically to sort of step in to the lineup and do some Drake London contested catch stuff on the outside on those back shoulder fades and whatnot. But as I said earlier, his route tree isn't that expansive in the games I saw. It's mostly fades, a lot of curls, hitches, slants, screens. Basically those 4 or 5 routes made up about 75% of the targets I charted in those 7 games. And so that's, I think, an area of growth that Casey Washington needs to run a more expanded route tree, and especially being able to get separation on a lot of those routes. He wasn't great at beating press, and that's, again, why he'll be a Z wide receiver instead of an X wide receiver. The X wide receiver lines up on the line of scrimmage. Typically, it's much easier to press that guy, and the Z wide receiver is a little bit off the line of scrimmage, and so it's a little harder to press that guy because he's going to be able to build up a little bit more speed with his release and whatnot. And then when you get to the sort of in and out breaking routes beyond sort of slants and whatnot, there was a little bit of struggles for Casey Washington getting in and out of his breaks in that regard. And that's kind of reflected in his testing, where it was like, I don't know if he's great in this area. And then to see him test as poorly as he did in the agilities in the 3-cone, in the short shuttle, where he was 10th percentile, according to mockdraftable.com, in the short shuttle and 2nd percentile in the 3-cone. So one of the worst 3-cones that they have charted in their 20 plus years of data that they have of various combine players. And so that made it kind of hard to find NFL player comps for them. And we'll talk more about the comps I wound up doing. And arguably, I went the lazy route just because it was hard to find other players that were like Casey Washington, that profile like Casey Washington, that, had, some of his metrics in terms of the explosiveness. The jumps were really good for Casey Washington, but the agilities were very poor for him. And there's just not a lot of wide receivers that test as poorly as Casey Washington did in the agilities that stick in the NFL. And you can argue that the agility tests are probably the number one test that you should pay attention to when it comes to wide receivers, more so than any other metric and whatnot. But like, there's a few that have had poor testing in the agilities, like Jarvis Landry. I think just because Jarvis Landry bombed all his testing, Anquan Bolden was not the world's greatest athlete, and I don't think necessarily probably didn't train as hard for the testing as you would probably do in today's NFL. Robert Woods is another guy that didn't have great agility metrics. DK Metcalf is probably the one sort of outlier. And of course, we know why DK Metcalf is able to overcome the fact that, he's like an aircraft carrier when it comes to turning, because he is literally like an aircraft. Like, you're not going to be able to stop his momentum when he gets up to speed. So, typically, the DK Metcalf comp is interesting because a lot of guys that test that profile like Casey Washington tend to be bigger, more physical, 6'3" contested catch guys. And even, outside of DK Metcalf, not many of those guys typically, succeed in the NFL or have long-term success in the NFL. But, it's not because Casey Washington can't contribute on offense, but the player that he profiles as today is really just a number 5, number 6 wide receiver that's not really going to get much run on offense. And you hope in the future he can climb further up the depth chart and develop in that time a more well-rounded skill set, improving his releases, improving that route running, and just get basically better at the details of being an NFL wide receiver. And if that does come in the coming years, then I think he can be a solid NFL receiver. We'll get to some of the player comps later and talk about some past Falcon players that were able to do that and one who didn't. And, if you're asking me to make a bet on whether Casey Washington is going to be that guy, I wouldn't necessarily, the odds are in his favor, but, there's a non-zero chance that he can develop into that, just given the boxes that he's checking as a quote unquote undersized contested catch guy, not necessarily having ideal quickness and burst to get easy separation when he's running routes, running a limited route tree, and not necessarily having a ton of production outside of that one game against Northwestern in his college career. That doesn't necessarily profile as a guy that typically goes on to have a high degree of success on offense in the NFL, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. I think instead Casey Washington profiles more like a special teams guy that could be a steady contributor on offense down the road. And that gets us to what I want to talk about next with Casey Washington, which is in order for him to stick in Atlanta long enough to develop as an offensive weapon, he needs to impact early on special teams. And I think he has the traits to be a special teams contributor, just lacks the experience, and we'll break that down further as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, summertime is great for a lot of things, but the sports aren't always sporting like we want them to now that the playoffs are done. And FanDuel is here to keep that, summer party going because they're hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. And whether you want to bet on baseball or you want to bet on the upcoming NFL season, you can get odds on how many yards, over under yards for Bijan and Drake and Kyle and Kirk and all those guys. You want to take a flyer on Michael Penix's offensive rookie of the year odds, go ahead, find it over at FanDuel and make the most of your summer at FanDuel.com. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Guys, I want to tell you about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you each and every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, news, opinions, and so much more. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube with the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. And don't forget to check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on those same platforms. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, I think the Falcons were pretty upfront in one of their post-draft breakdowns of Casey Washington in terms of why they liked him. And talking about how their area scout kind of scouted him mainly for special teams because they had the traits to sort of be a gunner on punt coverage units. He just lacks the experience to do it. He did get some reps as a gunner during his freshman and sophomore year at Illinois back in, I think, 2019 and 2020. Only played about a total of 15 snaps on punt coverage units, only 15 career snaps on kickoff coverage units. And from what I've gathered, a lot of the stuff that he's done on special teams in recent years has been kind of part of the hands team on like onside kicks and whatnot. But like I said, the traits, the tools are there. Essentially being a gunner on punt coverage is like being a deep threat outside wide receiver. You're going to line up wide outside. You have to be quote unquote press against the defender that's trying to keep you from getting downfield. You got to stack that defender, who's trying to block you and get downfield as quickly as possible, similar to how you would stack a corner on a go ball and then you sprint downfield instead of catching the football. You're trying to make a tackle against the punt returner. And I think Casey Washington has the tools to do that. He has the size, the speed, all that. Just doesn't have a ton of experience doing that throughout his collegiate career just a couple of years ago. And, I think there will be opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, for him to showcase what he can do both on special teams and offense this summer and preseason. But I do not expect us to see a lot of Casey Washington during the regular season, just because I think those special teams jobs for Washington will be going to, especially that gunner spot on the punt team, will be going to KhaDarel Hodge and Antonio Hamilton, two proven candidates in that. Not to mention you have Avery Williams on the roster as well. Dane Cruikshank also has a lot of experience as a gunner on punt coverage if he should beat out, Micah Abernathy for that fourth safety spot. And so, I'm not expecting Casey Washington to really carve out a significant role on special teams as a rookie unless there are multiple injuries at that position. But what is notable about all those guys I mentioned that are presumably, better options than Casey Washington, all of those guys are free agents after the season. So I think the plan for the Falcons is to probably have Washington kind of redshirt this year. He'll probably be the number 6 wide receiver on the depth chart, which means he probably won't play on offense unless there's like 3 injuries or more at that position. And so there's a good chance he'll be inactive most weeks and he'll be on the sort of scout team during the practice week and all that stuff. And so not expecting a ton of Casey Washington this year, but next year should, one or more of those guys like Hodge and Hamilton walk in free agency, then you're expecting Casey Washington to kind of be penciled in to replace one or more of them. And you're hoping that he can make that year 2 jump, not just on offense, but also on special teams, because it goes back to something we talked about with Jace McCullen in his breakdown, where it's like, there are effective special teams players, and then there are essential special teams players. And Casey Washington is hoping, I think, in year 2 to carve out a role as an essential special teams player. And if he can do so, that's going to give him the runway to stick on the roster for multiple years. That will give him the time to develop more as a complete wide receiver, right? Because again, I think he's a couple of years away from being someone that you can expect to make any significant contributions on offense. And I'm going to spoil one of my player comps for later in the episode, but my floor comp for him is former Falcons wide receiver Frank Darby. And they have similar size. Darby also didn't test particularly well in his agilities, although better than Casey Washington. Washington's more explosive than Frank Darby was. But you saw Frank Darby come in and struggle to impact on special teams, and it made it really hard for him to stick on the roster, especially in comparison to someone like a KhaDarel Hodge. And that made it hard for Frank Darby to develop as a wide receiver. And hopefully that isn't the case for Casey Washington. I think they're going to have like a 2-year window for him to impact. This year as a redshirt. Next year, he'll have an opportunity to really impact on special teams. And if he can do so, that's going to buy him the time. That's going to give him the chance to go into year 3 as a, not necessarily a lock, but a near lock to make the roster, because he has that established special teams contribution. And then you're hoping year 3, year 4, you can see that growth and that development pay off on offense in a major way. And so maybe by the time you reach the end of his rookie contract, you see Casey Washington as a regular contributor on offense for the Atlanta Falcons, and that will give him an opportunity to potentially land a second contract here in Atlanta or elsewhere. And we'll see if he can develop into that. But since I let the cat out of the bag about, my floor comp for Casey Washington, let's get into some of those other player comps for him. And I'm going to spoil it that I compared him to 3 Falcon players, which I've never done before. That's unprecedented. I've done 2. I've never done 3 when it comes to the floor, ceiling, and eye level. And you'll find out which ones. And one of them did go on to become more than a special teams player and become an impact wide receiver in the NFL. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So before we get into the NFL player comps, I think your next first listen here on Locked On Falcons, I think will be our last round 1 matchup of the Falcons Historian Player Shootout, which will be Jonathan Babineau tomorrow on the podcast. And then we'll have our first round 2 matchup, which should be about John Abraham a little bit later in the week. And then at the end of the week, we should hopefully wrap up with a Zion Logue breakdown. If my timeline, we might have a guest on the podcast as well this week. I can't do math in my head on how many episodes, right? Yeah, no, I guess maybe that guest will be next week, right? Because that'll be 5. But we'll see. But let's get into my player comps for Casey Washington. So as you guys well know, if you've been regular listeners over the years, I do floor, ceiling, and eye level, 3 sort of player comps as a spread of sort of potential outcomes for these players, because drafting is hard and projecting players is hard, and you never know what the development, is going to be for players. And that is definitely true when it comes to some of the players I compared Casey Washington to. But the floor to me is what a player is entering the NFL. The eye level or the ceiling is what to me, the max development the player can reach should he, go on and get the proper development and the perfect situation and all that stuff. And then the eye level is the sort of the halfway point between the floor and the ceiling, which is the more realistic outcome for that player. And as I've mentioned before, and going back and looking at these floor, ceiling, and eye level counts that I've given out for several Falcons draft picks over the last 6 years, in my evaluations, only about 15% of the Falcons drafted players have reached their ceiling, and about 40% reached their eye level. So that kind of tells you what these odds are like. So as I mentioned before, I went with the unprecedented Falcons trifecta. I like using at least one. I often use like one Falcon player on these player comps because I know you guys know who that player is. And so like it makes sense, even if it isn't necessarily the cleanest fit from an athletic or production standpoint, but try to find players of similar size, athleticism, and career projections when it comes to that. And as I mentioned before, my floor comp for Casey Washington is Frank Darby. My ceiling comp is Russell Gage. And then my eye level is KhaDarel Hodge. And so with Darby being the floor, it's basically that's a guy that I think can come in and play special teams, but not really do a whole lot else right away. And whether or not, Casey Washington is going to be a better special teams player than Frank Darby. Again, in theory, I think he has the traits to do that because, again, Frank Darby's biggest knock was, he was a deep threat at Arizona State that wasn't very fast. Like, it's hard, covering punts, running a 4.6 is not going to lead to a ton of success in that arena, and that was the case. So I think Casey Washington running in the 4.4 range gives him a leg up in that regard. But we'll see if he can go beyond the Frank Darby level as his floor. That ceiling comp to me is a player that went well beyond their special teams value to the point that now he's, we'll talk about this more later, but now like you don't even remember that he was drafted for special teams, and now he's been a reliable contributor on offense for basically the better part of 5 years in the NFL. And then that eye level is a guy that was primarily makes the NFL roster because of his special teams value, but in KhaDarel Hodge is a player that will contribute on offense when possible, has averaged over the last couple of years like 10 to 15 catches a year. And that to me is probably the most likely outcome for Casey Washington. He's probably going to be a guy that, he can get a couple of catches a game or so, but is not going to be necessarily a guy that moves the needle for your offense, but is primarily on your roster because of his special teams value first. And when he does get opportunities on offense, can contribute in that arena. But let's talk about Russell Gage. Let's talk about the potential of Casey Washington and revisit Russell Gage, who also did not have this great profile as a wide receiver prospect, only spent 2 years as a wide receiver at LSU and whatnot, and had joined a stacked roster back in 2018, and it was hard to sort of see him climbing the depth chart behind guys like Julio and Mohamed Sanu, and they had just drafted Calvin Ridley as well, and you had Justin Hardy still on that team, and even the great incomparable Marvin Hall was on that team as well. So it was hard to sort of see at that point in time the vision of Russell Gage being more than just a special teams guy, which is why I've pointed out in the past he's one of two players alongside Foye Oluokun from that same draft class of players that have far exceeded their ceilings in terms of my evaluation of a player, because I just sort of saw Russell Gage as this gadget wide receiver that barely played that position at college, wasn't, great, or just solely a slot receiver, and the Falcons had plenty of capable slot receivers, more established slot receivers on the team. And it's like, okay, well, how is he going to get up the roster? But to Russell Gage's credit, he went on and developed really well, right? He turned into a good number 3 wide receiver by the time he got to year 3. And he was drafted to be a special teams and a gunner and all that sort of stuff. But he developed enough that the Falcons were willing to move on from Mohamed Sanu in year 2. That sort of opened the door for him to get more opportunities as that number 3 wide receiver in year 2. And Gage really hasn't looked back in terms of special teams. Like, he really has played, I think, 4 snaps as a gunner since the Sanu trade. And all of those came in 2019. Like, he's basically played no special teams for, the better part of 4 years or 4 or 5 years. And, you wouldn't have guessed that, like, he was drafted just to basically be a Matt Slater type of player. If you know Matt Slater, the longtime Patriots wide receiver / gunner on that team. And so that's kind of what you're hoping for in terms of the max potential of Casey Washington, which is a player that, like, oh yeah, we drafted him to be a special teams player, but by years 3, year 4, whatever, he's developed enough as a offensive contributor that you forget the fact that he started out on special teams. And again, would I bet on that being a likely outcome for Casey Washington? No, but it's certainly possible. And that gets to the crapshoot nature of trying to project these players. Like, again, as I said, like, I never would have guessed Russell Gage would have been, catching passes from Tom Brady and whatnot, and Tom Brady would have been actively recruiting Russell Gage to come play for his football team because of what Tom Brady saw in him as a wide receiver when the Falcons had drafted him back in 2018. So we'll see if Casey Washington can get there. And again, part of that is just hard to know what the future of the Falcons wide receiver core is going to look like, right? When we get to 2026, when Michael Penix is presumably the starting quarterback for the Falcons, like, who are his weapons going to be? Like, we can sit here and make a pretty educated guess that Drake London's still going to be around because he'll still be under contract under his rookie contract. But Darnell Mooney's really only locked in for the next 2 years. Same thing with Ray McLeod. Both of those guys could be gone in 2026. Who knows if Rondell Moore and KhaDarel Hodge are going to be there since they're free agents after this season. Who knows if they'll be back in 2025, let alone 2026. And so, we live in, there's so many diverging paths and alternate realities and whatnot that the Falcons could go down specifically at the wide receiver position, not just wide receiver, but pretty much across the roster. And it's one of those things like, there's one path where the Falcons go out there and use premium picks on wide receivers over the next 2 drafts. And then all of a sudden, like, you're not really looking at Casey Washington's potential climb up the depth chart. And he's just basically a backup player that is functional in that regard and just sort of caps out as being, a number 4, number 5 wide receiver. Or the Falcons certainly could be on a path where they don't use premium picks on a wide receiver. And we're talking about Casey Washington heading into 2026 as the front runner to be the number 3 wide receiver for, Michael Penix because of the strong bond that they built, in these first 2 summers where they were working with the second and third string guys and whatnot. So who knows at that point in time? So that's where it's hard to sort of project in the future with any sort of degree of confidence. And so that's what gives you the hope for Casey Washington is that sort of unknown opens the door for opportunities. But again, if I'm betting, he'll stick around for 2 or 3 years, primarily as a number 5 or number 6 wide receiver. And I think the Falcons should be able to find better options in the draft at the wide receiver position to have more upside on offense. So, if I'm Casey Washington, I need to be that sort of essential special teams player in the meantime, so I can basically keep a job long enough so that I can potentially turn into the next Russell Gage and move up the depth chart. But we'll see if Casey Washington can do that. That's going to do it for us here on that breakdown. We got one more of these to go. We should be able to get to Zion Logue by Thursday night here on YouTube, Friday morning, or whenever you listen to it on your preferred audio platforms. So make sure you stay tuned for Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Check out us. We'll have some guests on as well as, training camp is right around the corner. We'll talk Falcons historian player shootouts, our ongoing summer series, which is going to go throughout the rest of the month as we get into training camp. So expect more of that in the coming weeks. So tune in to Locked On Falcons as your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every